Archaic Records.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Archaic Records here with you again. My name is Jamie, coming to you from Nashville, Tennessee. Here to welcome you into episode number 166. Today we're going to be taking a quick look at the newest album by California punk rock icons, the legendary SOCIAL Distortion. SOCIAL Distortion formed in Fullerton, California back in 1979. The band released their first album, Mommy's Little Monster, in 1983, an album that, despite the fact that I would say it is an outstanding debut effort, it is an album that today I don't necessarily go back and listen to with as much frequency as I do some of the other material in SOCIAL Distortion's canon. Not long after that, the band released 3 albums in a row that are, in my opinion, 3 of the greatest California punk rock albums of all time. I mean, who does that? First of all, how many artists are actually capable of creating 3 classic albums throughout the entirety of their career, let alone 3 genre-defying masterpieces in consecutive order? The band's hot streak began in 1988 when they released their second album, Prison Bound, an album that is easily my favorite in the SOCIAL Distortion canon. I think it is an album that, in my opinion, is virtually perfect. I love the production on that record. I love how raw and gritty it is. I love the songs. I love the performance. Mike Ness is a person that would appear to me to be very committed to his craft in terms of always bettering himself as a singer and a songwriter, and I think it really becomes apparent on the album Prison Bound. Not to mention the fact that my favorite SOCIAL Distortion song of all time is housed on the album Prison Bound. Get it? Housed? Prison Bound? Yes! I mean, is this thing on or what, son? The song in question is entitled On My Nerves. For some reason, it has always been my favorite SOCIAL Distortion song. There is just an anxiety to that tune, along with the lyrics that really drive the point home. It is just, in my opinion, a perfect punk rock song. In 1990, the band released their third album, the self-titled SOCIAL Distortion. Not only my second favorite album in the band's canon, but probably the band's most well-known. In 1992, the band released their fourth album, Somewhere Between Heaven and Hell. This is where I first leapt aboard the SOCIAL Distortion train. I remember distinctly the first time I saw the video for the song Bad Luck on MTV's 120 Minutes. There was just something about the band and the song and Mike Ness's aesthetic that, I had never really seen before, and I remember I made it a point that I was going to go out there and purchase my very own copy of Somewhere Between Heaven and Hell, and on one of my next trips to my local record stores, I made that come to fruition. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I do believe that the first copy I ever owned of Somewhere Between Heaven and Hell was actually on cassette, but I brought it home, I listened to it, and the rest of the album was just as good as the song that I had heard on MTV. It was a record that pretty much immediately grabbed me by the bacon and the eggs, and I was pretty much a big SOCIAL Distortion fan moving forward. After that, in 1996, the band released their fifth album, White Light, White Heat, White Trash. This is also an album that, despite the fact that I would say in terms of quality, it is probably a half step behind the 3 albums that preceded it, White Light, White Heat, White Trash is an album that I still very much like. It is a sentimental album for me because this, I do believe, was the very first tour in which I ever saw SOCIAL Distortion live. SOCIAL Distortion is a band that I have seen live 3 times over the course of my fandom, and I can tell you, at least in my personal experience, they are a band that never disappoint me live. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I was having a conversation with one of my clients, an individual that is also from California, somebody that is also a big SOCIAL Distortion fan. We got on the topic of the new record, Born to Kill, and after we sort of beat that topic to death, we went back and we started discussing some of the other records in SOCIAL Distortion's canon, at which point in time This particular individual told me that his least favorite Social Distortion album was by far White Light, White Heat, White Trash, because it was too, as he described it, a little bit too grungy. This is an individual that does not like grunge in any way, shape, or form. In fact, he often uses the adjective grunge as an insult. And I remember thinking to myself, that's a very interesting analogy for White Light, White Heat, White Trash. I have never heard that album described as grunge. I've never really heard anything in the Social Distortion canon described as grunge. Now, despite the fact that I don't necessarily think it is a grunge album, it is an album that is a very different album than the 3 albums that came out before it. For one thing, the production on that record is a little bit overbearing. It is a little bit slick. It has a little bit more of a mainstream sound, but there is still a lot of snugness sprinkled in on White Light, White Heat, White Trash. I do love the debut single off of that album, I Was Wrong. I like the Rolling Stones cover, despite the fact that I am not in any way a Rolling Stones fan. I like the cover of Under My Thumb, and my favorite song off of White Light, White Heat, White Trash has always been Down Here with the Rest of Us. That is, in my opinion, one of the better songs in the entire Social Distortion canon. In 1999, Mike Ness released his solo album, The Countrified Cheating at Solitaire. This was an album that when it was first released, I wasn't exactly sure how I felt about it. Country music isn't, nor has it ever been, my luggage. And, I bought the album immediately upon its release because I was a huge Social Distortion fan at the time. And I had learned to trust Mike Ness over the years. And I can tell you that when I got Cheating at Solitaire home, it was an album that at first I wasn't exactly sure of. But, in relatively short order, it was a record that grew on me. It was a record that at that time was probably perfect for me in the sense that, my life was a little bit in flux in 1999. I was sort of laying the groundwork for my first breakup, which I was having a very difficult time with. I was considering moving out of state for the first time in my life, and there was just something about those songs on that record that really latched themselves onto me. And Cheating at Solitaire is a record in the Social Distortion Mike Ness canon that I still go back and listen to probably as much as anything in the Social Distortion catalog, apart from the album Prison Bound, which of course is my favorite album of all time, at least in the Social Distortion world. I also saw the Cheating at Solitaire tour in 1999 at the Crest Theater in Sacramento. That tour was absolutely amazing. That was probably one of my favorite Social Distortions shows that I had ever seen. I remember distinctly that Deke Dickerson opened up the festivities that evening. Deke Dickerson, not necessarily being somebody that I am a huge fan of, but he did put on an interesting show. Contemporary rockabilly is just something that I'm not really a huge fan of. I do love old rock and roll. I love, the first wave of rockabilly. I love doo-wop, but I don't know. There's just something about contemporary rockabilly that has always kind of annoyed me. I don't know. I am a person that basically lives his entire life according to song lyrics, and although I would argue that from time to time I am willing to sort of suspend believability, I just have a hard time in, the 2000s listening to people sing about taking their best gal to the sock hop and the soda fountain when intellectually there has not been a sock hop or a soda fountain in 50 years. Later in 1999, Mike Ness released the second of his 2 countrified solo albums, this one being called Under the Influences. This was an album that, based on my love of Cheating at Solitaire, I went out and I purchased right away. It is an album that I do enjoy, although I enjoy it much less than I do Cheating at Solitaire. It is an album that does have a few nuggets on it. I really like the version of I Fought the Law on that record. Of course, the highlight for me is the countrified version of the Social Distortion classic Ball and Chain. In 2004, Mike Ness returned under the Social Distortion moniker with their first album in 8 years. That was the band's 6th offering. It was called Sex, Love, Rock and Roll. This was an album that I believe I pretty much purchased immediately upon its release, an album that, for the first year and a half to 2 years of its life, I listened to pretty extensively, but eventually it was an album that I sort of shelved, and, to be perfectly honest with you, it is not an album at this point in time that I go back and listen to very often at all. 7 years after that, in 2011, the band released their 7th album, Hard Times and Nursery Rhymes. This was an album that, based on my sort of lukewarm relationship with sex, love, rock and roll, this was a record that my expectations for were a little bit tethered. But I can tell you, even having said that, Hard Times and Nursery Rhymes was a big disappointment for me upon its release. Now, I am a fan that is willing to recognize that there is a recipe when it comes to Social Distortion. There is a sound, there is a songwriting style that this band sort of, has practiced throughout the course of their career. This is not a band that usually goes out there and reinvents the wheel with every new album, but there was just something about Hard Times and Nursery Rhymes that, to me, was a little bit too formulaic. It felt a little bit cartoonish, as a Social Distortion album. So it was an album that I did purchase, I did listen to a few times. I think I still have it lying around up here in this record room somewhere, but it is a record that I never go back and revisit. A couple of weeks ago, when I began the writing process for this episode, I went back and I tried to listen to Hard Times and Nursery Rhymes, and I got about halfway through it. It just really does absolutely nothing for me. It is easily my least favorite album in the Social Distortion canon. So when it was announced that Social Distortion was coming back in 2026 with their first album in 15 years, I was very excited, although, a little bit hesitant about my wanting to jump right into full, ecstasy mode in terms of this record, because the last 2 Social Distortion records, Sex, Love, Rock and Roll, and in particular, Hard Times and Nursery Rhymes, were records that I liked very much less than the rest of the albums in their canon. But, I am a Social Distortion fan. This is a band that I have been following since 1992, and whenever it is that they release any new material, I am going to be interested in it. I am going to purchase it basically immediately upon its release, but this was an album that I was, a little bit unsure of. And finally, on May 8th, the band released their first album in 15 years. The album, of course, is called Born to Kill. My first impression of the artwork was that I just absolutely loved it. Social Distortion is a band that has always had remarkably cool artwork in terms of their sleeves. I love the photography on the back of this record. One thing about Social Distortion that is funny, this is probably a Mike Ness thing. Mike Ness, of course, being a huge guitar gear nerd. There's a nice centerfold of Mike Ness's guitar. Now, as much as I love music, which I do, I may not be the most intelligent person in the world, which is obvious to anybody that pays attention to this channel, but, I do love music. But one thing I am not is I am not necessarily a gear nerd. Looking at the picture of a guitar is not necessarily something that is going to have me impregnating my trunks, but if you know Social Distortion and you know Mike Ness, he is a giant guitar nerd, and therefore the artwork in the inlay of this record sleeve makes a tremendous amount of sense. I love the photography on this record. This is just an album cover that, in my opinion, is awesome. This record, as I mentioned a second ago, was released on May 8th, 2026. It is produced by David Sardi. David Sardi is somebody that is probably most known in terms of a performer from the band Bark Market. Bark Market is a band that I first got turned on to back in either the very end of 1999 or the early part of 2000. After I moved to Seattle in September of 1999, I had a coworker that was an absolute nerd for art rock, noise rock, anything that had a Steve Albini sort of edge to it. I mean, that was his luggage. And I remember he tried to get me turned on to the band Bark Market. He was somebody that was much smarter than I was, somebody that had a little bit more avant-garde taste, I would say. But, I was very interested in some of the music that he liked, and I remember being out at one of my local record stores one day in Seattle and stumbling upon the CD for the Bark Market album, Elron, and I picked it up. It was an album that I brought home, and I listened to it, and for the first year or two I had that album, it didn't really do much for me. It was something that was definitely over my head. But over time, Bark Market is an album, I think, as I've matured and as my musical palette has developed and I've become a little bit more open-minded, Bark Market is an album or a band that I do like. The album Elron is an album that I still do own. It is an album that I might bring onto this channel at some point in time, but to be honest with you, I'm so backlogged with other episodes I have to get done that it might take a while. But I really love the production on this record. In fact, I would say the production on this record sort of harkens back to my favorite Social Distortion album of all time, that being Prison Bound. The first song on the album is the title track, Born to Kill, a song that was released as a single a few weeks before the album dropped. And I remember the first time I listened to the single, Born to Kill, a lot of my anxiety about this record was immediately relieved, because this, you could tell pretty much immediately, was a huge step up from the albums that the band had put out back in 2011 and 2004. This felt like Social Distortion once again, running on all cylinders. There's just an energy to this song that I immediately loved. The song starts off, and as I said a second ago, you think to yourself, yep, this is Social Distortion. There is a recipe when it comes to the Social Distortion sound. I was curious, after 15 years away and all of the health concerns that Mike Ness has had throughout the course of those last 15 years, how he was going to sound in terms of his vocals. And as far as I could tell, his voice was no worse for wear. He sounded awesome. Yes, he sounds a little bit older, as do all of these legacy artists, but, his voice has aged remarkably well. In fact, I would say that age has probably, added to his voice instead of subtracting from his voice. Mike Ness has that singing style that is just so recognizable, and adding a little bit more gravel into the mix is never something that I'm going to complain about. This song, I believe, is about the early days and the enduring impact and legacy of punk rock. This is, as I mentioned a second ago, this is like quintessential Social Distortion. It has that snarl. Mike Ness has said in interviews that this is sort of a retrospective album. This song, when I first heard this song and I heard that interview with Mike Ness talking about the fact that this was going to be a little bit more of a retrospective album, I mean, the two of those synced up perfectly. It's also, I would say, making a more retrospective album at this point in a band's career, a legacy band such as Social Distortion or Morrissey or any of the other artists that we talk about on this channel, is, not only appropriate, but it's also par for the course. I love the song Born to Kill. I was thinking about this album as I was listening to it the first couple of times, and one of the terms I would use to sort of describe this album. Now, we are all familiar with the term coming of age. This album and some of the other albums that I've been talking about by legacy artists, newer albums that have been coming out over the past few years, I would sort of, now this may be a term that already exists. I'm not trying to steal something that is out there, but I was thinking of this in terms because we're all aware of, the term coming of age albums. Social Distortion in their younger years did release a few, I think, coming of age albums. This, in my opinion, is more of a coming of middle age album because it does sort of have a tendency to be a little bit retrospective, but at the same time, it is forward thinking. I think that is one of the sort of cool tightropes that this album walks. The second song on the album is a song called No Way Out. Very similar in sound to the first song, the single. Born to Kill, it has that real signature Social Distortion snarl, that real guitar heavy sound that everybody that likes Social Distortion is a fan of. This song talks about confronting your past, demons in particular, possibly addiction, embracing the challenge of change, and discovering the fact that wellness is a journey, understanding the fact that you don't reach your destination until somebody is spreading your ashes into the Pacific Ocean. Mike Ness, over the past several years, has been very transparent about his sobriety. I think in a way this song is probably about his sobriety. I saw an interview with him as he was doing press for the album, in which he was being interviewed by some sort of bubble-headed disc jockey on K-Rock, and they sort of bonded over the fact that they had both been members of AA for several years. I really love the song No Way Out. Again, I think that this is a song that is forward-thinking, forward-looking, with a sense of optimism that you didn't always get from Social Distortion in the past. The third song on the album is called The Way Things Were. This is a little bit of a slower song. This is probably one of my favorite songs on the entire album. It is absolutely beautiful. Again, a little bit retrospective in terms of lyrical content, but it paints the picture of wayward, possibly troubled youth, dead-end kids committing petty crime, getting high, getting fucked up. The song talks about how he began to plan his escape with an old guitar, a stolen riff, and a song. The song being the most important ingredient to that escape. Social Distortion is a band that, in my opinion, has always had the song. That's one thing that Mike Ness has always been incredible at. He is, in my opinion, when he's on his game, I think he is one of the greatest songwriters in the history of punk rock. I think this song is relatable to anybody that finds themselves in the strange position of becoming, like an aging punk rocker. This song is very easily relatable. The song talks about, in a way, wanting to go back to the way things were, simpler times growing up in the 70s and the early days of punk rock. Again, very retrospective. I don't know that the narrator of this song necessarily wants to go back in time and wants today to be like things were in the 1970s, but I think growing up when Mike Ness did, it was a much different time in terms of technology. Even when I grew up, I was somebody that did not grow up on internet. I did not grow up on social media. The modern world is something that, even for somebody that is my age, younger than Mike Ness, it's something I'm not native to. It's something that my wife is much more native to. It's sometimes you can even find yourself feeling like an alien in this world in terms of technology, in terms of pop culture, social culture, especially when you talk to young people. I have a career where I talk to young people all day, every day. And, I can't even begin to tell you how many times I just feel like a fossil based on their references in terms of technology and pop culture and the things that they're into. I think that that's what this song is talking about. It is not necessarily, wanting to go back in time, but it's just describing the differences between the world that we live in now and the world that we grew up in. The next song after that is a song called Tonight. This song has a very story of my life type vibe. If you are a Social Distortion fan, a fan of the classic era, this is a song that to me feels very much like the story of my life. It describes a smoldering relationship. This topic is really one of Mike Ness's wheelhouses in terms of songwriting. It's funny, Mike Ness, of course, has this gruff exterior. He's covered in tattoos. He's got the greaser aesthetic. He's a guy that looks like, he spent several years in the state can, but I get the sense that deep down underneath all of that barbed wire, Mike Ness is, at the end of the day, a hopeless romantic. I love the lyric in this song where he says, "We're a couple of broken souls who left a lot of dreams on the table." I love that lyric. This is one of the best songs on the entire album. Story of My Life, of course, is one of the biggest classics in the Social Distortion canon. The next song after that is a song called Partners in Crime. This song once again goes back to the origins of the band. The narrator of the song just wants to be heard. He has something to say, and he's just in search of the proper vehicle. That, in my opinion, is the definition of punk rock in its most simple terms. Young people wanting to be heard and discovering that this was their avenue in which to be heard. To me, that is the definition of punk rock, especially if you were somebody that grew up in a sort of, dysfunctional house as a social outsider, going all the way back to the early days of Social Distortion, the early days of punk rock, coming of age, realizing that your generation doesn't really have a voice. You're getting pretty sick of the 60s. You're getting pretty sick of the 1970s in terms of music, listening to bands like Steely Dan on the radio, realizing that it in no way has anything to do with your life or who you are. I love the lyric in this song that says, "If talking gets you nowhere, you'll simply have to scream." Punk rock. That, again, in my opinion, is the definition of punk rock. That's why this style of music, it isn't a fad. It isn't a fashion statement. It is a way of life. Much like the band Evil Conduct described it in their song Skinhead Till I Die, one of the greatest songs in the history of punk rock. In my opinion, punk rock is something that probably chooses you more than you choose it, and it is something that is just impossible to give up. I am asked all the time by people at my work, clients and co-workers, and people who live their lives reading the Wall Street Journal and making tea times. They always ask me, when are you going to outgrow this shit? I mean, can you really be a punk rocker in your 70s? I don't know. If I live that long, I suppose we'll find out. In my opinion, that's sort of what this song is talking about, is the early days of punk rock and why it still matters to those of us that have sort of chosen this as our lifestyle. The next song after that is a song that I don't necessarily love. This is a song called Crazy Dreamer. This is a song that I can relate to in terms of lyrics. I am a total daydreamer. It is probably something that, sometimes acts to my detriment because I am somebody that is not always grounded in reality. I am a person that has traveled a lot. I am a person that, is always in search of greener grass. And there have been times in my life when it has probably worked against me. It is a trait that oftentimes has me feeling very sort of unsatisfied with my life and what I've done with my life, and always looking and trying to do more. It is a song that I love lyrically, but it is a song that has that sort of Cheating at Solitaire, contemporary rockabilly, countrified sound to it. I mentioned earlier, I do really like the album Cheating at Solitaire. It is an album that I go back and listen to time and time again. So it isn't necessarily that it has that sound that I don't really like this song, but it's just I would say in terms of quality, it is just sort of a lesser version of a song that you would find on Cheating at Solitaire. But I will say, if Crazy Dreamer is one of the weaker songs on the album, that is not necessarily an insult to the album as much as it is a compliment, or an insult to the song, as much as it is a compliment to the album, because the album is really very good. And if this is one of the weaker songs, which it is still a song that I like, I think that is actually a compliment to the album. But the next song is my least favorite song on the album. It is the cover version of the Chris Isaak classic, I use the term classic in air quotes, Wicked Game. Chris Isaak is somebody that I do apologize if you are a fan of. I am probably in the minority when I say this, but Chris Isaak is somebody that I just simply do not understand. I had a girlfriend back in the early 2000s, and every time she thought of Chris Isaak, I mean, she literally dampened her trousers. She thought that he was the absolute jugs. She listened to his music all the time. Chris Isaak is somebody that I just do not understand, and Wicked Game is a song that I never liked, even when it was popular. And I would make the argument that the Social Distortion version of it, especially with Mike Ness's vocals, which typically I would defend to the death, but Mike Ness's vocals do not work on this song. This, in my opinion, is by far the weakest song on the album. In fact, when I saw the track listing for this album, this was one of the songs that I was the most curious about because, I don't really like Chris Isaak. I don't really like the song, and I was sort of curious as to how well Mike Ness was going to be able to pull this song off. In my opinion, this was a swing and a miss. I hate to say it, but it's simply my opinion. Now, the one thing you have to give this song credit for, if you are somebody that is of my age, is the video for the Chris Isaak song Wicked Game, which featured the always delectable Helena Christensen. That was a video that in my life, in my chronology, came out at the absolute perfect moment in time, right as all of my hormones began to rage. And I can tell you, as much as I did not like the song, when that video came on MTV, I was not sobbing, son. Another video that came out, I think, roughly around the same time. Another video that, for a hormone just raging teenage American male, another video that was just simply perfect in its timing was the Madonna video for the song Cherish. Both of these videos have one thing in common. They have very attractive, young women frolicking on the beach. My best friend and I wore out that Madonna video for the song Cherish. I can say the same thing about Wicked Game by Chris Isaak. I mean, I would turn the volume off and I would just watch that video over and over and over again. I think it's possible that video may have been responsible for impregnating my trunks a couple of times, if you understand what it is that I'm saying to you now. The next song on this album is a song called Walk Away. This is a song that I very much love. This is one of the better songs on the album. This is a song that makes me think of a specific incident in my life, a relationship that I was in for 5 years, a relationship that I have discussed on this channel many times in the past, a relationship that was simply, on its best days, repugnant, a relationship that somebody somewhere someday should write a book about. Now, I'm not necessarily nominating myself to write this book because I don't really want to go back and relive the horrors of that 5 years. And I'm not even blaming the person that I was in the relationship with. Trust me, it takes two people to make a relationship that is that malignant. But it was a relationship that towards the end had a hard time coming to an end. It was one of those relationships where we would split up and we would get back together, and we would split up and we would get back together, and it just became this disgusting pattern. At a certain point in time, I made the decision that it was not going to work unless I physically removed myself from the premises. So what I did, now this was something that I was thinking about doing for quite a while. I was thinking about moving back to California. After 13 years in Seattle, there was just something, I was beginning to feel homesick. My time in Seattle was beginning to sort of fall apart. I was becoming a person that I was not necessarily infatuated with. I wanted to sort of get my life back on track. I wanted to start making better decisions for myself, and moving back to California was one of the things that I had just implanted in my head as being a good option. And one night with my ex-girlfriend, things really got ugly, and basically what I did, without even thinking twice about it, was I went to the airport, I left, and at least in terms of living in Seattle, I never went back. This is somebody that I have had no contact with since then, a decision that at the end of the day turned out to be one of the best decisions I ever made, because about 6 months after I left Seattle, I ended up meeting my wife, and her and I have been together, and I've been happy, at least for the last almost 15 years. So it was a decision that worked out very well for me. That was the first thing I thought about when I listened to the song Walk Away. I am also a person that, even before that move, I'm a person that has moved around a lot. I am a person that in the past has probably had a tendency to run away from himself, and that was another sort of one of the things that this song made me think of. There's a couple lyrics in this song that I just absolutely love. Again, in my opinion, Mike Ness as a songwriter is just unbelievable. In fact, I would say that he is, as I mentioned before, somebody very committed to his craft in terms of always improving. Some of the lyrics on this album, I think, are some of the best that Social Distortion has ever produced. I love the lyric where he says, there's a rundown graveyard on the edge of town, and people say that that's where the truth is found. I love that lyric. That is one of the best lyrics that Social Distortion has ever put out, in my opinion. The next song after that is a song called Never Going Back Again. This has a real sort of bluesy riff, kind of a punk blues kind of riff to it. You know, blues music, especially blues rock, is not necessarily my luggage all the time, but it is something that Social Distortion, Mike Ness in particular, I know is a fan of. I think that this song is about sobriety. I think that this song is, he talks about being one of the fortunates that made it out alive. He talks about some of the lyrics in the song I really like. Is he says, there's run-ins with zombies, I was lurking with the living dead. Again, I think this song is about sobriety. Mike Ness has been very open about his sobriety throughout the last several years. He's talked openly about his relationship with AA, although I wonder if you are talking about AA, I wonder how anonymous it is. Bad joke. But again, I think that song is about his sobriety. The next song after that is a song called Don't Keep Me Hanging On. I love this. I love the lyrics to this song. This is another one of the better songs on the album. I love the lyric where he says, I woke up pleasantly guilty. Yeah, I was worried about the things that I had said and I had done before. This song makes me think of my life before I met my wife. My wife is somebody that has just been an absolute godsend in my life. I was a person that spent a giant bulk of my late 20s and 30s basically making every mistake in the world. Now, I was not necessarily a person that was going out there and committing crimes, but I can tell you that I basically spent 15 years drunk. I was not a very nice person out there in the public. I did not take my job seriously. I ended up moving around a lot. And, you know, all of this sort of coincided when I mentioned it a little while ago, talking about wanting to get out of Seattle, move back to California, start making better decisions, start trying to clean my life up, deal with my bitterness, deal with my anger, trying to discover where all of that was coming from. All of that sort of coincided with meeting my wife, and her and I have sort of been on this journey, each of us our own journey, but we have both been on this same journey together. That's sort of what this song makes me think of. The last song on the album is a song called Over You. I would say that this is a decent album track. It isn't a huge standout track in terms of, you know, some of the other material on the album. I think that this song is basically about lost love. I think that this song is talking about a person that realizes that, you know, hey, I may have made a mistake or two in my past. It probably cost me some pretty, you know, relationships with some pretty decent, good people. And, you know, there is a little bit, again, of retrospective, there's a retrospective nature to this song, but it is a song that, again, not necessarily one of my favorite songs on the album, but I think it is a decent way to close out the album. One of the things that's interesting about this record, at least in terms of the vinyl, is this is a 3-sided album. There is no side D, so it's side 1, 2, and 3, but it is an album that, you know, I am very happy with for the most part. I will be seeing Social Distortion coming up next month at a place here in Nashville called The Pinnacle on August 31st. I have not seen Social Distortion. Now, I think I mentioned it earlier. I've seen Social Distortion 3 times. I saw Mike Ness solo 1 time, so I've seen him a total of 4 times. I was thinking about this the other day. I don't think I have seen Social Distortion probably since 2012, maybe 2011. Maybe it was actually on the Hard Times and Nursery Rhymes tour, which again is not necessarily my favorite album of all time, but I have not seen Social Distortion in quite some time. I am very excited. I'm very excited to go see that show. Social Distortion is a band that, in my personal experience, has always killed it live. Mike Ness always sounds great live. One of the things about this album I was hoping for in terms of buying tickets to go to this show was I hope that the new album is just good enough to where when he plays material off of the new album, I will not see it as an opportunity to take a beer and piss break, to skedaddle out of the auditorium. And to be honest with you, I think that this album accomplishes that. I think this album actually exceeds that. There are a lot of songs on this album that not only would I not mind seeing live, but songs that I am very excited to see live as well. That show in August here in Nashville at the Pinnacle is something I'm very excited about. I've been to the Pinnacle once before. My wife and I went to go see Kraftwerk not long after the Pinnacle opened here in Nashville. It is a wonderful venue. Most of the venues here in Nashville, I've mentioned it on this channel before. I shall mention it again. One of the nice things about living in Nashville as a music lover is the venues in this city really are world class. The Pinnacle is no different. Morrissey will be playing the Pinnacle here in October, fingers crossed, of course. Social Distortion will be playing with fellow California punk rock icons, the legendary Descendants. The Descendants is a band that I've seen several times also live. The last time I saw the Descendants was not long before my wife and I left California, so not long before the whole COVID thing. We saw them at the UC Theater in Berkeley. That show was absolutely amazing. I love the Descendants. The Descendants are a band that I need to bring onto this channel. I don't know what I'm doing, but whatever it is, I'm not doing it well. But I am very excited to go see two of the greatest California punk rock bands of all time live right here in Music City, USA. Now, let's not get nuts. Let's not get crazy. Let's not say anything that's not true. Yes, Social Distortion and the Descendants are California icons. They are legends. But come on, man. They aren't Mr. T experiencing. I am very excited to see that show, though, assuming, of course, that people at the Pinnacle are able to conduct themselves in somewhat appropriate manner. Actually, that is one thing I'm very curious about. Going to see Social Distortion on this tour, I don't think I've seen Mike Ness really in the smartphone age, or at least not in the way that smartphones, run our lives nowadays. So I'm sort of curious to see what Mike Ness's relationship is going to be with the cell phones. I wonder if this is something that is going to have a policy, or if it doesn't have a policy, if it's something that is going to annoy him. I have seen Mike Ness light up a crowd on a couple different occasions throughout the shows that I have been to, and usually when he does it, I would say that it is well justified when it happens. I do remember one time, actually it was in Sacramento, when I saw him on the Cheating at Solitaire tour at the Crest Theater. He blew somebody up in the front row. It was awesome. Mike Ness is actually also responsible in terms of live for one of my most uncomfortable moments at a show in my life. I was seeing Social Distortion in San Francisco. Actually, it might have been the first time I ever saw them. It was either the first or second time I ever saw them, and I was very close to the stage, and all of a sudden, out of my left, on my periphery over here, I see something floating very slowly in the air, and it comes down on the stage. It was a shoe. And as Mike Ness was playing, he had his arm out for where he was holding the neck of his guitar, and the shoe sort of just barely brushed him. It didn't really hit him, but it barely brushed him, and the band stopped on a dime. And for what was probably legitimately 15 or 20 seconds, now that may not seem like a long time, but when you are uncomfortable and there is this dead silence and you know that somebody is just boiling under the skin, it made for a very uncomfortable moment. Mike Ness finally stopped what he was doing. He turned around. He went back to the drum riser, had his back to the crowd. I'm assuming, he was sort of trying to gather himself. And finally, after, again, what seemed like an eternity, probably 20 seconds, but it seemed like an eternity of dead silence in a packed venue, The band finally continued on. I could not believe that somebody was so stupid as to throw something on stage. I will say this about the contemporary, concert experience. As much as I hate cell phones in my face and people talking about their stupid kids' swim team practice, that is one thing you don't really see as much anymore that you used to see a lot in the 90s, is stuff flying at the stage. I think at least we've sort of, evolved in that sense. I can't think of anything more stupid than throwing something at a blind musician who's just trying to perform their music for you. It is something that is just beyond disrespectful. So assuming the crowd can maintain themselves and behave themselves in a somewhat proper manner, I am very excited to see Social Distortion and the Descendants in August. I think it's my next big show coming up. Actually, that's not true. My next big show coming up in July is Steel Pulse. Oh my God. I cannot wait. The 50th anniversary of Steel Pulse. Are you kidding me? Why are we all just becoming wadded up piles of gristle? Anyway, man, thank you so much for checking out this video. This is Archaic Records. My name is Jamie, coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee. Be sure to go out and support your local record store like the Black Hole in Fullerton, California. Check back for Morrissey Monday, a celebration of all things Morrissey and the Smiths, as well as other record content and album reviews throughout the week. And I feel pretty good about this, so I'm going to dismiss you now. So until next time, my friends, talk to them.